When the Russian invasion of Ukraine started back in February of 2022, pretty much everyone, including both Russian and American military analysts, expected that Ukraine would lose Kiev and thus the war within 2 weeks. What if that prediction came true? Before we begin, let me briefly ask you to subscribe, as that helps my channel a lot. Also, a quick disclaimer, this video is meant to be informational, not political or agenda driven. Please take everything I say with a grain of salt and remain civil in the comments. In 2022, Ukraine surprised the whole world with their strong resistance against the Russian invasion. Like I said, nobody expected the war to last nearly as long. If someone told me in the first week of the invasion that Ukraine is still fighting in the end of 2024, I would have probably called them crazy. To answer the question of the video, we first need to talk about why Ukraine was able to hold off Russia so well. Once we know that, we can determine what we need to change for the Russian invasion to succeed. There's many reasons actually, like their strong morale, the huge foreign military aid they received, and Russia being generally weaker than we all thought. So how can we realistically change these factors so Russia's invasion becomes more successful? Basically, we actually just need to make Russian military advisors smarter. They had a very arrogant attitude towards Ukraine and strongly underestimated them on many levels. If Russian leaders correctly estimate how well Ukraine is willing and capable to fight back, they could use their superior numbers and equipment to their fullest advantage. When Russia invaded Ukraine in our timeline, they made one very big mistake. They underestimated their enemy. As Sun Tzu taught us, never do that. But what could they change about the invasion if they actually estimate for a strong Ukrainian resistance? First of all, the invasion would come as a far bigger surprise. In our timeline, nobody was shocked when Russia launched the invasion, as they had a massive troop buildup on the border for weeks. Also, Putin threatened with the invasion directly if Ukraine doesn't promise to stay out of NATO and move away from the West. From his perspective, that's not a stupid move entirely. He basically thought that he could bully Ukraine into rejoining the Russian sphere by just threatening violence. However, as we know, that plan completely failed. Let's assume for this timeline that Putin never uses this open rhetoric and keeps his plans for invasion more secretive. They disguise their mobilization as exercises and prevent any significant leaks. This significantly limits Ukraine's time to prepare. Of course, Ukraine still isn't taken completely out of the blue, as they have been building up their military in preparation for a war with Russia since 2014. Still, this already puts them in a significant disadvantage compared to our time. Many cities, especially Kiev, had time to build up defenses. Now that precious time is lost. Also, in combination with being more secretive, Russian military advisors estimate the logistical needs for the war better and prepare accordingly. They plan for more robust supply chains and establish well-secured, well-stocked supply depots closer to the Ukrainian border. Now it is ensured that Russia will not face any fuel, food or ammunition shortages anytime soon. This allows them to move more troops towards Kiev than in our time. Also, this time Russian priorities are a little different. Instead of full-on marching into Ukraine, their first attack comes via air. They start the war on February 24 with a massive air campaign. They target Ukrainian air defense systems and airfields to ensure total Russian air superiority. Now the ground forces follow behind. This time Russia is able to better support troops like the ones advancing on Kiev and simultaneously limit Ukraine's ability to defend or redeploy as effectively. With total control over the sky, Russian forces advance quicker while facing fewer ambushes and counterattacks. Also, one critical shift in this timeline is Russia preparing a targeted decapitation strike. In our reality, Russian planners seem to expect President Zelensky to surrender quickly rather than stand and fight. In this alternate scenario, they correctly anticipate that he will resist fiercely. Consequently, they orchestrate strikes aimed at Ukraine's leadership in the opening days of the war. While some of these attacks might succeed, it is unlikely they would manage to eliminate Zelensky himself. Let's assume Zelensky survives, but several key government officials and military leaders are lost. The impact on Ukrainian morale would be severe. The loss of leadership would strain both the civilian population and the remaining political and military leaders, including Zelensky. Facing heightened fear and pressure, Ukraine's leadership would be more inclined to consider surrender or negotiations. I believe these changes, entirely achievable within Russia's military capabilities, would enable them to capture Kiev within 2 weeks. Now let's assume the war's early stages unfold similarly to our reality, except this time Kiev teeters on the brink of collapse and Russia achieves faster advances along the front lines. By the 2-week mark, the situation has shifted dramatically and a new question emerges: will Ukraine surrender? On March 6th, President Zelensky, Mayor Vitaly Klitschko and other high-ranking officials flee Kiev in the early morning hours. The Ukrainian government, recognizing that Kiev is undefendable, has spent the last 2 weeks preparing to relocate its capital to Lviv, a major city near the Polish border. As the sun rises, Zelensky's convoy moves in strict secrecy, with only a few select aware of his exact route. By the time he and other key figures reach Lviv, the city is declared Ukraine's temporary administrative capital. Its proximity to Poland, a NATO member, makes it a strategic choice, allowing for safer transportation of weapons weapons and supplies into Ukraine. Meanwhile, Kiev falls entirely into Russian hands. With the capital secured, Russia continues its aggressive push through eastern Ukraine, achieving faster progress than in our time. The Ukrainian military begins consolidating its defense positions along the Dnieper River and around Lviv, but the outlook remains bleak. Cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol and Odessa fall into Russian control. Although many Ukrainians are determined to fight on, the situation forces both Zelensky and Western leaders to confront a harsh reality. Resisting Putin at this stage would likely be disastrous. The nations pressure Zelensky to enter negotiations with Russia, and reluctantly, he agrees. On March 17, Zelensky meets with Putin under immense international scrutiny. Ukrainian animosity towards Russia is at an all-time high, but without significant Western intervention, Ukraine has no realistic path to reclaim its lost territory. With the West still reeling from the rapid fall of Kiev, Zelensky finds himself with no leverage at the negotiation table. He's forced to accept Putin's harsh demands, which include the following. Territorial concessions. Ukraine must officially cede large swaths of its territory to Russia. This includes all oblasts east of the Dnieper River, as well as Mykolaiv, Odessa, Cherkasy and Kiev Oblast. Additionally, Ukraine must formally recognize Crimea as Russian territory and renounce any future claims to these regions. Neutrality and demilitarization. The remaining Ukrainian territory would be recognized as sovereign, but only under strict conditions. This new, smaller Ukraine must remain permanently neutral and fully demilitarized. Any alignment with NATO or Western powers is explicitly forbidden, including hosting military exercises, Western advisors, or participating in defense initiatives. Essentially, Ukraine becomes a geopolitical buffer zone under Russian influence. Russian-controlled transitional government. Moscow insists on installing a transitional government to restore democracy in Ukraine. In reality, this would serve as a facade for placing Kremlin-aligned leaders in power, ensuring that the new Ukrainian government operates as a Russian puppet state. Lviv, now the official capital, would host this new administration. Legal immunity for Russian forces. All Russian military personnel and officials involved in the invasion would receive complete legal immunity. This provision protects them from prosecution by Ukrainian or international courts. While court bodies like the Hague would dismiss such immunity, the treaty would give Putin a document to justify his actions and offer political cover for other nations to continue cooperating with Russia. Economic dependence on Russia. Ukraine would be required to reorient its economy towards Russia and the Eurasian Economic Union, effectively shutting out Western economic partnerships. This policy would boost Russian business and ensure Ukraine's economic dependency, further consolidating its status as a puppet state. Finally, as part of the agreement, Zelensky and key officials would be forced into exile. Putin promises not to prosecute Zelensky provided that he participates in the negotiations. By March 18 at 6 p.m. the peace treaty is officially enacted. Ukraine in this alternate timeline is reduced to a Belarus-like state under Moscow's thumb. The political fallout from such a rapid and successful Russian campaign in Europe, essentially a modern-day blitzkrieg, would be enormous. Before analyzing the international response, however, we need to address Ukraine's reaction to this imposed peace. While Zelensky's decision to negotiate stemmed from sheer necessity, many Ukrainians, including segments of the military, would refuse to accept such terms. Resistance fighters would likely launch a guerrilla war against Russian occupiers, determined to reclaim their homeland. In response, the Russian military would conduct brutal crackdowns, arresting dissidents, raiding villages and violently suppressing any signs of rebellion. These measures would only fuel anger amongst Ukrainians and deepen international outrage, creating a volatile post-surrender environment. The seeds of an extended insurgency would undoubtedly be sown, further complicating Russia's occupation. As the initial shock of Russia's victory fades, Western nations led by the US, UK and European Union would move to impose sanctions on Russia and condemn Putin's actions. While the sanctions would be severe and the rhetoric harsh, history has shown that such measures often fall short of delivering tangible results on the international stage. Putin would mitigate the effects of these sanctions by strengthening economic ties with China and India. Additionally, much like in our timeline, Europe would struggle to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, further limiting the effectiveness of Western responses. During the invasion, a clear rift would emerge within Western political circles. Resistance versus appeasement. Many nations, particularly former Soviet states such as Poland and the Baltic nations, would advocate for a strong, united front against Russia. On the other hand, countries like Germany might hesitate to impose heavy sanctions, favoring a more cautious, appeasement-oriented approach. This divergence in strategy would lead to tensions within NATO, with member states divided over how to handle the crisis. The alliance would face a significant challenge to its unity, precisely the outcome Putin desired. The more fragmented NATO becomes, the weaker its collective deterrence, giving Moscow additional leverage on the global stage. With legal immunity granted by Ukraine's puppet government, Russia would claim legitimacy for its actions, insisting the invasion was necessary to restore peace and stability. However, much like in our timeline, Moscow would still face widespread condemnation and increasing isolation on the world stage. This new geopolitical reality would open an opportunity for China to position itself as a mediator, or so it might initially appear. Contrary to popular belief, China and Russia are not fully aligned in our timeline. While both share an interest in countering American hegemony, their partnership is far from a formal alliance. For instance, China has abstained from voting with Russia on certain UN resolutions and refrains from directly supplying weapons to Moscow. However, in this alternate timeline, Chinese leadership would likely view Russia's triumph as a signal of a new global order. Aligning more closely with Moscow would solidify Beijing's position in this emerging power dynamic. While it's improbable that China and Russia would form a NATO-style military alliance, they would likely increase intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and strategic coordination. This deeper partnership would mark the beginning of a unipolar axis, challenging Western dominance. The most critical international reaction would come from the United States. With NATO fractured over whether to resist or appease Russia, the Biden administration would face immense pressure to balance deterrence with avoiding escalation. To counter Russian aggression, Biden would likely increase the deployment of US troops to Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and the Baltic states. Additionally, a significant portion of the US Navy would be sent to patrol the Baltic Sea as a show of force. These moves would serve a dual purpose: to reassure NATO allies of America's commitment to the alliance, and to deter Russian aggression against NATO member states. The US would also invest heavily in training Eastern European militaries, providing advanced weaponry and logistical support to bolster regional defenses, while avoiding direct confrontation. These measures would send a clear message to Putin: any attack on NATO would provoke a unified response. Speaking of NATO members, back when the Ukraine war started, Finland and Sweden both were in NATO. In our time, as a reaction to the invasion, they joined later. The same would happen in this time, but far quicker. In both nations, the public and political perception would heavily favor joining NATO, and the alliance would be very happy about it, as the two traditionally neutral nations would signal a strong united front to Russia, possibly deterring them further. As the dust settles from Russia's swift victory in Ukraine, it becomes clear that the world has entered a new and uncertain era. Russia, emboldened by its military success, begins eyeing further European territories, leveraging its newfound reputation for strength and effectiveness. China, meanwhile, grows increasingly tempted to accelerate its plans for Taiwan, potentially moving its timeline for invasion closer to 2027. This new global order marks the decline of Western dominance and the rise of a bipolar world, with Russia and China leading a united front against the fractured democracies of the West. The world watches nervously, bracing for what comes next. The United States now finds itself in an extremely precarious situation. Many military advisors and analysts warn that World War III may be only a few years away, with the looming possibility of a dual-front conflict. The prevailing fear is that Russia might attack NATO states in Europe, while China simultaneously launches its long-anticipated invasion of Taiwan. Debate rages in Washington over which front should take the priority. However, a general consensus emerges that the US should adopt a Taiwan first, Europe second policy in the event of war. This approach is driven by two key factors. First, Europe's defense capability. NATO nations in Europe, while strained, are better equipped to hold off a Russian offensive compared to Taiwan's chances of resisting a Chinese invasion. And secondly, Taiwan's strategic importance. Taiwan is the world's leading manufacturer of microchips, a resource vital to global economies and national security. Losing Taiwan to China would have catastrophic consequences for the US and its allies. The Biden administration strongly urges European nations to significantly increase defense spending and modernize their military forces to counter Russia independently. Many nations, particularly in Eastern Europe, comply by ramping up their military budgets and strengthening defense measures. However, progress is uneven. Nations like Poland and the Baltic states rapidly expand their defenses, but larger Western European nations face challenges. Germany, for instance, struggles to overcome decades of underinvestment, with an outdated and under-equipped military that is ill-prepared for its size and strategic importance. While Europe scrambles to prepare, Putin begins planning his next big move. With the West distracted by internal debates and a divided NATO, he sees an opportunity to further assert Russian dominance, setting the stage for yet another chapter in this new era of global instability. The phony war refers to a period in World War II when very little happened on the Western Front. After Germany invaded and defeated Poland, both the UK and France declared war, but neither country took significant action against Germany, with only minor skirmishes occurring along the border between France and Germany. This period ended when Hitler launched his blitzkrieg through the Benelux countries into France. In this scenario, although World War III has not yet begun, Russia and China both recognize that it's only a matter of time. Both nations understand that the sooner they escalate, the better their chances. But the unexpected nature of this opportunity means they need time to prepare. China in particular requires more time, while Putin, with his well-established plans, is already positioning himself for the aftermath of Ukraine's fall. While the exact course of action Putin would take is speculative, based on his character and strategic mindset, it's clear he would solidify control over the newly acquired Ukrainian territory. Ensuring stability in the region would be a priority, but this would require considerable time and resources, as many Ukrainians continue to wage an active guerrilla war, further straining Russia's effort. Over time, the resistance in occupied Ukraine weakens, though it never disappears entirely. Russia's control over the region solidifies, but at a heavy cost, as reports of horrific crimes committed against civilians to suppress the resistance mount. NATO members debate whether to support the Ukrainian resistance covertly, but the United States, wary of escalating tensions, shuts down any ideas of direct involvement. By August 2022, only a small number of Russian forces are still actively combating Ukrainian insurgents. Once Russia feels confident enough, Putin begins preparing his next move. This time the operation is much smaller and less risky than the invasion of Ukraine. He assembles an army near Moldova's border, not to fully invade the country, but to annex the breakaway region of Transnistria. This region, while part of Moldova, is effectively independent and has a pro-Russian sentiment. The people of Transnistria have long desired to join Russia, but had been unable to do so until now, given their proximity to Russia's border. Putin issues Moldova an ultimatum: to hand over Transnistria or face invasion. Given the West's reluctance to intervene, Moldova complies, and Transnistria is annexed without further escalation. Many in the West speculate that Russia's next target might be Georgia, but Putin refrains. While an invasion of Georgia would send a clear message to former Soviet republics about the consequences of aligning with the West, the invasion of Ukraine has already made that point. Additionally, Georgia offers no significant military advantage, and more importantly, it serves as a buffer state between Russia and Turkey. By not invading Georgia, Russia can focus its efforts on the European front, which it sees as more critical to its success in any upcoming global conflict. In the months following, global activity slows. Both sides engage in an intense propaganda campaign. While scrambling to bolster military capabilities, the US increases its military presence in Taiwan, pressuring allies in the region to oppose China strongly and to be ready to join the fight if necessary. Meanwhile, Europe struggles under the weight of energy shortages, economic stagnation, and rising inflation due to the loss of Russian energy imports. As a result, calls for a European army grow louder, signaling a shift towards a more unified defense posture. After months of discussion, votes, legal debates and diplomatic negotiations, the European Union finally reached a consensus. Thanks to the leadership of figures like Macron and Donald Tusk, Europe officially announced in January 2023 that it would create a joint European army. This decision would force all EU member nations, even neutral countries like Austria, to participate in the army in the event of an attack on Europe. The combined military strength of the EU now began to take shape, with nations working together to build up their collective defense. Putin, however, seizes the opportunity to further his narrative of the West being imperialistic. India, which currently acts as the leader of the neutral bloc, condemns the creation of the European army, aiming to regain favor with Russia, with whom they still maintain trade relations. By mid to late 2023, Russian and Chinese diplomats meet in total secrecy to discuss strategies for a potential war with the West. They agree that the best course of action is to strike first. While Putin had originally planned to provoke NATO gradually in hopes of fracturing the alliance, the formation of the European army makes it clear that NATO is unlikely to break under pressure. Consequently, Russia and China decide to launch a full-force strike simultaneously. The goal is to stretch US resources thin by opening up two fronts at once. In practice, this means Russia will attack NATO members in Europe, while China invades Taiwan. By doing so, they hope to overwhelm the US, which will not be able to fully commit to both fronts for fear of losing the other. Both Russian and Chinese military forces begin heavy preparations for their respective campaigns, holding large-scale exercises regularly. Meanwhile, both countries start shifting their economies towards military production, further fueling fear in the West. But the West is not idle. In the Pacific, Australia, South Korea and Japan all pledge to defend Taiwan with full force. As 2024 begins, the US presidential election cycle slowly heats up, with both Republican and Democrats beginning to consider their candidates. In this timeline, Joe Biden is notably more popular than in our world. The war in Ukraine was short-lived, never putting significant strain on the US economy. Although the situation in Gaza continues to hurt his polling, the Democrats, as in our world, chose him as their candidate. The Republicans, however, once again select Trump. The stage is set for a historic election between Biden and Trump. In secrecy, China and Russia agreed to launch their attacks during the final weeks of the election cycle, hoping to strike the US at a particularly vulnerable time. However, history suggests that once the US faces a major external threat, it will quickly unite, with the main internal debate being how to allocate resources between the two fronts. With this, the stage is set for World War III. On one side we have the Russia-China coalition, and on the other NATO, Japan, South Korea and Australia. Israel will also play a role, though it will be preoccupied with its own conflicts. Iran too may seize the opportunity to strike at Israel, though the dynamics of that situation are complex. I won't go into further detail about how the war would play out, as it is nearly impossible to predict and would take far too long to explain. Feel free to share your thoughts on which side you think would win in the comments. In conclusion, if Russia had taken Kiev within 2 weeks, our world would likely look very different today. Russian overconfidence could have very well sparked another world war. How soon that would have happened is anyone's guess, but I believe my scenario is quite realistic. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. If you're interested in more of my videos, check out the ones on screen. The video on the left explores a timeline where the Beatles don't exist, leading to the Soviet Union's survival. It may sound crazy, but I think it makes some compelling points. On the right, you can watch part 1 of a series where a successful January 6th insurrection leads to a civil war. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.